started with a single rule: never hike past sundown. Locals swore by it, but to 4 friends, it felt like an old superstition. They laughed it off. But by the time night fell, the laughter was gone, and so was one of them. The forest doesn't forget. It doesn't forgive. And sometimes, it doesn't let you leave. In 2010, 4 close friends set out for what was meant to be a simple weekend getaway, a hike through the serene wilderness of Hoh Rainforest. The trail was remote, far from civilization, and known for its breathtaking views. But it also had a darker reputation. Over the years there had been whispers, hikers who vanished without a trace, strange sounds in the night, and warnings etched into forgotten signs. For Anna, David, Rachel, and Michael, these warnings felt more like ghost stories than reality. But as the sun set on their first day, they began to realize the stories might not be stories at all. This is the story of their hike, and the one who never made it out. The trail began like any other. The morning sun filtered through the trees, and the forest buzzed with life. The group moved effortlessly, their laughter blending with the rustling leaves and distant calls of birds. For hours, it was perfect. But as the afternoon stretched on, the atmosphere began to change. It was Anna who first noticed something was off. She stopped mid-step, tilting her head. "Do you hear that?" she asked. But the others shook their heads, brushing it off. To them, the forest was quiet. Too quiet. That's when the first sound broke the stillness. A single crack, like a branch snapping, far in the distance. "Probably just an animal," Michael joked, his voice light. But the group's pace quickened. Minutes later, they stumbled across something strange. A torn shoe lying in the middle of the trail. It looked old, weathered, as if it had been there for years. David picked it up, frowning. "Who leaves just one shoe out here?" he muttered. Rachel noticed the tracks first. They weren't human, and they weren't like any animal she'd ever seen. Long grooves etched into the ground, leading off the trail and vanishing into the undergrowth. "Let's keep moving," she said, her voice tight. No one argued. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The air grew colder, heavier, as if the forest itself was pressing down on them. Anna stopped again, her breath catching. "There it is again," she whispered. This time they all heard it, the pounding, slow, deliberate, and coming from somewhere deep in the trees. David laughed nervously, trying to break the tension. "Probably an echo," he said, though his voice wavered. They pressed on, their pace now bordering on a jog. But the pounding followed, louder now, closer, accompanied by the occasional snap of branches in the distance. When they reached a clearing, relief washed over them. For the first time in hours, they felt they could breathe. But that relief was short-lived. On the far edge of the clearing, just beyond the tree line, something moved. A dark figure, standing perfectly still, its outline barely visible in the fading light. None of them dared to speak. None of them dared to move. And then, without warning, the pounding stopped. The silence that followed wasn't natural. It was suffocating. And in that silence, they realized David was no longer with them. "David!" Anna's voice cracked as she spun around, scanning the darkening forest. The clearing they'd just entered felt impossibly large now, the shadows creeping closer. There was no sign of him, no footsteps, no sound, nothing but the stillness that pressed against them like a weight. "He was right behind us," Rachel whispered, gripping Michael's arm. "I saw him a second ago." But Michael didn't answer. His flashlight was shaking in his hand, its beam flickering as if the batteries were failing. And then they heard it. A sharp guttural noise, like a deep exhale, coming from somewhere in the trees.
"Run."
"Run," Michael said, his voice barely audible. At first they didn't move, frozen in place, their eyes locked on the forest. And then, as if breaking free from a spell, they bolted. The pounding followed them, growing louder, faster, as if whatever was out there had started to chase them. Anna tripped, hitting the ground hard. Michael turned back, pulling her up as the sound of snapping branches grew deafeningly close. "Don't stop!" Rachel screamed, her voice barely audible over the pounding, which now felt like it was coming from every direction. They burst onto the trail, their lungs burning, their legs barely holding them up. But the pounding didn't stop. The forest around them seemed alive now, shifting and twisting, the trees closing in like a labyrinth. "This isn't the same trail," Anna gasped. "This isn't where we came from." And then they saw it. Standing in the middle of the trail, blocking their way, was the figure. This time, it was closer. Its outline was clearer now, but its features were wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. And its eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the dark. They froze, paralyzed by fear. And then it moved. Not toward them, but around them, circling the group with an unnerving speed. The pounding started again, faster and louder, until it felt like their chests would burst from the vibrations. "It's leading us somewhere," Michael whispered, though his voice was trembling. "It doesn't want us to leave." And then, suddenly, the sound stopped. The forest went silent, the air heavy with an unnatural stillness. When they looked up, they were standing at the edge of a massive ravine. The drop was endless, swallowed by darkness, and across the gap, just barely visible in the moonlight, stood David. "David!" Anna screamed, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned and disappeared into the trees, his movements eerily smooth, almost inhuman. And then the pounding started again, this time from behind them. "David!" Anna's voice cracked as she spun around, scanning the darkening forest. The clearing they'd just entered felt impossibly large now, the shadows creeping closer. There was no sign of him, no footsteps, no sound, nothing but the stillness that pressed against them like a weight. "He was right behind us," Rachel whispered, gripping Michael's arm. "I saw him a second ago." But Michael didn't answer. His flashlight was shaking in his hand, its beam flickering as if the batteries were failing. And then the pounding started again, this time from behind them. When the pounding finally stopped, it was morning. The sun broke through the canopy, and the forest, once menacing, now felt eerily normal. Anna, Rachel and Michael found themselves back on the main trail, as if they had never left it. There were no strange symbols, no signs of the ravine, just the familiar dirt path leading back to the trailhead. The park rangers didn't believe their story. "David must have gotten lost," they said. A search party combed the area for days, but no trace of him was ever found. No footprints, no torn clothes, not even his voice calling out in the distance. It was as if he had vanished entirely. Weeks turned into months, and David was declared missing, presumed dead. But Anna, Rachel and Michael knew better. They had seen him, if that was even him, on the other side of the ravine. And they had heard the pounding, a sound none of them could forget. Michael tried to convince himself it wasn't real. Rachel moved away, refusing to talk about that night. And Anna, despite her best efforts, found herself unable to shake the feeling that something was still watching her. Sometimes, late at night, she swears she hears it, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, outside her bedroom window. The forest was closed to the public a year later, after more hikers reported strange occurrences. Whispers on the wind, phantom footsteps, and the sound of something heavy pounding through the trees. No one dared go back. And to this day, the question remains, was it the forest itself, or something far older, far darker, that claimed David that night? What do you think? Was it something supernatural, or just an unexplainable tragedy? Share your theories in the comments. What if the wilderness you trust to be safe is hiding something that challenges everything you thought you knew about nature, and even reality itself? A place where your every step feels watched, where every sound carries an unsettling weight. What if the woods aren't just trees and trails, but something more? Something waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. By the end of this, you'll never look at your own hikes the same way again. And you might start wondering, what lies just beyond the edge of the trail? It was supposed to be a normal hiking trip, a quick getaway into the woods, away from the chaos of everyday life. The air smelled fresh, pine-scented, the kind that fills your lungs with every breath. The forest seemed peaceful, almost welcoming. There was nothing unusual about the place, nothing that would cause any concern, or so they thought. But as the sun dipped lower behind the trees, a change began to take shape. A faint unease lingered in the back of their minds, unnoticed at first. Small things, like the way the birds seemed to go silent just before dusk. The faint rustle of movement, always just out of view. Nothing overt, nothing that would make you immediately suspect something was wrong. But for those who dared to listen closely, it was enough to make them question whether the woods truly were as peaceful as they appeared. There were two of them, friends, both experienced hikers. Alex, the skeptic, and Sarah, always ready for adventure. Neither of them had any particular interest in stories about strange happenings in the woods. They trusted the trails, trusted their gear, and trusted each other. Alex, in particular, was dismissive of any talk of the supernatural, believing in logic and reason above all else. But as the days wore on, even Alex couldn't deny the strange shifts in the air. The sudden drop in temperature for no reason, the shadows that stretched just a little longer than they should have. Sarah, ever the dreamer, began to feel it too. A sense of unease, an odd feeling that they weren't quite alone. Their connection to each other grew stronger, but so did the dread. It wasn't fear, not exactly. More like an instinct, something they both couldn't explain. But they ignored it. They had to. They were in the woods, in a place they knew. What could possibly go wrong? At first it was nothing more than strange sounds, a branch snapping somewhere far off, a whisper of movement in the underbrush. They convinced themselves it was animals. But then it started to get harder to ignore. At night, the stillness was unsettling. The usual sounds of the forest, crickets, wind, seemed to vanish. It was as if the entire forest held its breath. Sarah woke up that first night, startled, to see Alex standing at the edge of their campfire, staring into the trees. His eyes were wide, but there was no recognition in them. He had no memory of walking out of the tent. Sarah called out to him, but it was as though he couldn't hear her. And when he finally returned to the tent, his hands were trembling. "I just had to get some air," he said, though neither of them believed that. Not anymore. By then, Sarah had begun to notice the map they were using, one that had been printed just before their trip, wasn't exactly accurate. Trails that should have been there weren't, and places marked as safe had no trace of the usual trail markers. Imagine for a moment. You're in the woods, just like Alex and Sarah. The wind picks up, the sky starts to darken, and you hear something moving just out of sight. How would you react? Would you stay, or would you turn back? Let me know what you'd do in the comments. And if you're curious to know how this story ends, make sure to hit that like button, because this is just the beginning. The forest wasn't done with them yet. The longer they stayed, the more it became clear. Something was pulling them deeper into its heart. The paths that should have led them back to safety only seemed to circle back on themselves, over and over. It wasn't long before they realized they were being watched. Every step they took, it felt as though the trees themselves were closing in. They thought they were just lost, but they were wrong. The forest wasn't simply hiding something, it was protecting something. Something ancient, something that shouldn't have been disturbed. And when Alex finally made the discovery, he wasn't sure if what he found was real or if it was simply his mind breaking under the strain. The map was never meant to guide them out. It was a trap, a way to keep them from leaving. The strange noises, the disorienting paths, the figures glimpsed in the shadows, these weren't coincidences. They had been brought there for a reason. Alex and Sarah, exhausted and desperate, stopped by a stream that twisted unnaturally through the woods. The water ran red, though whether it was rust from upstream rocks or something more sinister, neither dared to say. Sarah knelt to inspect it when Alex suddenly grabbed her arm. "Don't touch it," he whispered, his voice trembling. She froze. His eyes weren't on the water but on something beyond it, a figure standing motionless among the trees. It was cloaked in shadow, its form indistinct, but there was an undeniable sense that it was watching them. When Sarah turned to look, the figure was gone, but its presence lingered, like a weight pressing on her chest. They didn't speak of it as they moved on. Speaking would make it real. By the third day, they no longer recognized anything. Every landmark, every familiar feature from the map was gone. The forest had shifted, reshaped itself into a labyrinth of dense trees and thick fog. And then they found it. An ancient stone altar, overgrown with moss and vines. Strange carvings covered its surface, symbols neither of them could identify, but which seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive. Alex approached first, compelled by something he couldn't explain. He reached out to touch the carvings, and the moment his fingers brushed the cold stone, the air changed. The forest roared to life. A cacophony of sounds erupted. Cries, whispers, and something guttural that made the ground tremble. The trees seemed to writhe, their branches twisting toward the pair like grasping hands. "Alex, stop!" Sarah screamed, pulling him back. But it was too late. The altar glowed faintly, and Alex collapsed to the ground, clutching his head. His eyes rolled back, his mouth moved, but the words that spilled out weren't his own. "They've been waiting," he muttered, his voice a strange layered echo. "You've brought them back." Sarah dragged him away from the altar, tears streaming down her face. She shook him until his eyes returned to normal, but Alex wasn't the same. "They're here," he said, pointing toward the trees. And then she saw them. Dozens of figures emerging from the shadows, their faces blank, their forms twisted and unnatural. They surrounded the pair, their movements slow but deliberate. "Run," Alex whispered, his voice barely audible. "You have to run." But Sarah couldn't leave him. She helped him to his feet, and together they stumbled through the forest, the figures closing in. The forest seemed alive, shifting to block their path. Branches lashed at their arms and faces, roots rose to trip them, and the whispers grew louder, filling their minds with fragmented images of rituals, sacrifices, and ancient beings that had slumbered beneath the forest floor for centuries. When they finally broke through the tree line, gasping for air, the world outside was eerily quiet. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over a landscape that seemed untouched by the horrors they'd endured. But the relief was short-lived. Alex turned back toward the forest, his face pale. "They're not done," he said. "We woke them up, Sarah, and now they'll come for the rest." Sarah grabbed his arm, shaking her head. "Number, we're out. We made it." But deep down, she knew he was right. The forest had let them go, but not out of mercy. It had sent them back as messengers, warnings of what was to come. As they walked away, Sarah glanced back one last time. For a moment, she thought she saw the trees shift, their shadows forming faces that smiled cruelly. The wilderness was no longer just a place of solitude and adventure. It was alive, ancient, and waiting. And it would wait, patient and unyielding, until someone else wandered too far beyond the edge of the trail. If you thought this story ended in the woods, think again. The truth about what happened to Alex and Sarah still lingers. What really lives in those trees? And could it be waiting for someone else? Like you? Want more? Subscribe now and maybe you'll find out. But be careful, some stories are better left untold.